The air was heavy with salt and the crispness of the holiday season as 12-year-old Georgia watched her family unload the car. They had driven for hours to reach this remote beach, tucked away from the bustle of the city. While her parents spoke enthusiastically about their plans for the trip, Georgia hung back, clutching her sketchbook. The isolated beach stretched out before her, framed by rolling dunes and dense scrub. It was beautiful, no doubt, but Georgia couldn't shake the feeling that this trip wasn't for her. It was for them, for her dad, who needed a break from work, for her mom, who loved being surrounded by nature, and for her brothers, who thrived on adventure. Georgia, however, didn't quite fit into their mold. She was the quiet one, the dreamer, more comfortable sketching in her room than kayaking or hiking. At home, it was easy to disappear into her books and art, but out here, with no walls to retreat behind, she felt like a stranger in her own family. The family set up camp near the edge of the dunes, their tents forming a small crescent around the fire pit. While her brothers eagerly unpacked fishing rods and frisbees, Georgia wandered toward the shoreline. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The waves lapped at her bare feet, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of peace. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted them. A group of horses emerged from the far end of the beach, their silhouettes sharp against the fiery horizon. Georgia's breath caught. They were wild, she could tell by their untamed manes and the way they moved, free and unbridled. Their hooves barely seemed to touch the ground as they galloped along the shore, manes streaming like banners in the wind. One horse stood out from the rest. He was larger, his coat a glossy black that shimmered in the fading light. A white star on his forehead, making him look almost regal. He moved with a grace and power that took Georgia's breath away. She watched them until they disappeared into the distance, her heart pounding. She had heard stories about the wild horses that roamed this area, but seeing them felt like stepping into a dream. A silent bond. The next morning, Georgia woke before sunrise, her curiosity pulling her out of her tent. She tiptoed past her sleeping family and made her way to the beach. The sand was cool beneath her feet, and the sky was just beginning to lighten. Then she saw them again. The horses. This time, she stayed closer to the dunes, not wanting to scare them. They moved in a loose cluster, grazing on patches of seagrass. The black stallion stood slightly apart, his head held high as if keeping watch. Georgia crouched behind a rock and sketched furiously, trying to capture the stallion's powerful stance and piercing eyes. She felt an odd connection to him, as though he, too, stood on the fringes of his world. Over the next few days, Georgia woke early to watch the horses. She noticed the way they communicated with each other, flicks of their ears, subtle shifts in posture. The black stallion fascinated her most. He was clearly the leader, yet there was a quietness about him, a solitude that mirrored her own. One morning, Georgia brought an apple with her. She sat cross-legged on the sand, holding the fruit out in front of her. The stallion noticed her, his ears swiveling toward her, but he didn't approach. Instead, he watched her for a long moment before turning away. Georgia wasn't discouraged, she knew trust would take time. The Christmas storm. On Christmas Eve, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the dunes, rattling the tents and whipping the sea into a frenzy. Georgia lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling as rain drummed against it. She thought about the horses, huddled somewhere in the storm, and felt a pang of worry. Were they safe? Would they be okay? The storm finally subsided in the early hours of the morning. As soon as it was light enough to see, Georgia grabbed her jacket and ran to the beach. The sand was littered with debris, seaweed, broken branches, even bits of driftwood, but the beach itself was eerily quiet. Her heart sank when she didn't see the horses. She walked along the shoreline, scanning the horizon, when a familiar figure caught her eye. The black stallion stood near the edge of the dunes, his glossy coat speckled with sand and his head lowered. As Georgia approached, she saw why. His hind leg was tangled in a length of fishing net, the rough fibers cutting into his flesh. He lifted his head as she got closer, his nostrils flaring and his ears pinned back. "It's okay," Georgia said softly, holding up her hands. "I won't hurt you." The stallion snorted, shifting uneasily, but he didn't run. Georgia knelt down, her fingers trembling as she worked to untangle the net. It was knotted tightly, and the coarse rope had cut deep into his leg. She spoke to him in a low, steady voice as she worked, trying to keep him calm. After what felt like forever, the net finally came free. The stallion took a cautious step back, testing his leg. He limped slightly but seemed relieved. Georgia stood up, brushing sand from her knees. "You're okay now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The stallion's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt like he understood. A Christmas ride. That afternoon, as her family gathered around the campfire for a Christmas feast, Georgia sat apart, her thoughts consumed by the stallion. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a deep connection to him, one that went beyond words. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, she spotted him again, standing at the edge of the dunes. He wasn't limping anymore, and he seemed to be waiting. "Can I go?" Georgia asked her parents, pointing toward the horse. Her dad raised an eyebrow. "Go where?" "To him," Georgia said, her voice unwavering. "Please." Her parents exchanged a glance before her mom nodded. "Be careful, sweetheart." Georgia approached the stallion slowly, her heart pounding. He stood still as she reached him, his gaze steady. Tentatively, she placed a hand on his neck. His coat was warm and smooth, and she felt his muscles ripple beneath her touch. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking him or the universe for bringing him to her. With a deep breath, she climbed onto his back. The stallion shifted but didn't protest. Then, with a powerful leap, he took off, his hooves pounding against the sand. The world blurred around her, the wind in her hair, the rhythm of his stride, the endless expanse of ocean and sky. Georgia laughed, a sound of pure joy that she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. In that moment, she felt free, as if she had shed all the doubts and fears that had weighed her down. The stallion carried her to a grassy clearing near the dunes. Georgia slid off his back, her legs shaky but her spirit soaring. She rested her forehead against his, her voice a whisper. "You're amazing." Belonging. That night, under a sky filled with stars, Georgia sat by the fire with her family. She felt different, lighter, braver. She realized she didn't need to compete with her brothers or fit into her parents' expectations to belong. She had found her place, not just with Blaze but within herself. When she looked toward the dunes, she thought she saw a shadow moving against the moonlight, a stallion standing tall, watching over her. And for the first time, Georgia felt truly at home.